Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we have another great Kentucky history episode here. Joining me today is Gary Odell.
Richards left Knoxville in company with Morris Keene, who for some reason was in that part of the country at that time. Perhaps he went with Richards when he went into Kentucky. We don't really know. So they traveled by rail down to Louisiana, and in Louisiana, he went to the plantation of General, well, he wasn't actually a general, but Thomas Jefferson Wells, which was in Rapides Parish near the city of Alexandria in western Louisiana. Now, earlier, Richards had had his horses sent from Transylvania Plantation further west to Dentley Plantation because the Union Army and Navy looked like they were going to achieve control of the Mississippi pretty soon, and they were very vulnerable to confiscation being there on a riverside plantation. So for safety, he sent them into western Louisiana. So he came to Dentley Plantation, checked up on the welfare of his horses, enjoyed the hospitality of T.J. Wells, and Wells showed off a horse that he favored very greatly. This was a horse that Richards became very enamored of and purchased him from Wells, promising to pay $5,000 in gold at a later time, and that was an enormous sum. Basically, doing a financial conversion from money at that time to today, it's a very simple way to do it is just to multiply by about 30. So he paid $150,000 for that horse.
Wow.
Now, he didn't have the money with him. It was a promise to pay later. And of course, the horse would stay there until after the war. Now, this horse he called War Dance. His mother, the mare who gave birth to that horse, was named Reel, and another horse in that family line was named Gallopede, which was also a form of dance. And so he named the horse War Dance to honor a dancing family that this horse came from, from their names. Now, while he was at Dentley Plantation, he was also struck by another attraction, and that would be Mary Editha Wynne, a young lady who is currently residing at the plantation with Thomas Jefferson Wells. She was about Richard's age, a little younger, and the two of them fell in love. Well, at that time, of course, Richards could not tarry because he had a mission to accomplish, but after the war, he would formally propose and marry Editha. So Richards went from Dentley Plantation into Texas and down to Matamoros, which is on the Gulf of Mexico. And what he needed to do now was to get into a blockade runner. Now, there was a kind of an agreement between the federal government and the government of Mexico not to interfere too much with what was going on at this port because it was, after all, a Mexican port. Even though they were acting as a supply gateway for the Confederacy, he didn't want to provoke the Mexican government. But, once out of the port, any ship he was on would be fair game for Union gunboats. So on a dark and moonless night, which we can presume because that was basically the way it did, and probably raining like hell, or can I say that? A dark, rainy, moonless night, they slipped out of the river mouth and headed for Cuba, and were probably flying a Cuban flag or a British flag. And from Cuba took another ship to Liverpool, England. And from Liverpool, Richards traveled to London, where he took up residence. Now, we can pretty well presume that while Richards was in England, he sort of reintroduced himself to the turfmen of that country. He was well known in turf circles, had become well known for his as one of the foremost breeders in Kentucky, and became one of the more esteemed Americans then in London, at least of the Confederate Americans, who were a small percentage of the Americans present at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
But they kind of, hung out together, socialized together, as you might expect from expatriates. And he was invited in 1864, I believe it was. It might have been 1863, but to the wedding of Belle Boyd. Now, Belle Boyd was quite notorious. She was a famous Confederate spy. Um, she was not actually all that attractive, but she had a very charming way with her and had been able to extract military information from various Union soldiers during her career as a spy in Virginia.
Mhm.
She was arrested by authorities and made such a nuisance of herself, basically hanging out the window and shouting, slogans supportive of the Confederacy and so on, that they finally let her go. But she continued her activities, and they arrested her again. And again, she was such a pain that they finally let her go with the promise that she would leave the country. Uh, at one point, she attempted to escape the country earlier and had boarded a ship outward bound from Baltimore, a blockade runner, but was captured by a Union ship. And there she managed to seduce one of the lieutenants aboard the ship, and to the point where she made him promise to turn over the code books
Oh,
and
wow.
join the Confederacy, and he did. But she was meanwhile taken back and imprisoned before they let her loose for the last time. He was not actually imprisoned, but he was discharged from the army. So she went to London, and Ensign Harding, he was an ensign rather than a lieutenant, my mistake, was finally able to join her there, and their wedding plans were announced. And the British had been following her exploits as a spy with great interest. She was of a great fascination to the reading public in Britain. At Belle Boyd and Samuel Harding's wedding, some of the more important Confederates then present in London were represented. Among them were a fellow called Caleb Hughes, Henry Hoates, James William, and John Lewis O'Sullivan. Hughes was the Confederates' principal arms procurer. Hoates and Williams were basically in charge of propagandizing. They published
Mhm.
various booklets, pamphlets, and newspaper articles trying to persuade the British government to recognize the Confederacy as an official country, which ultimately proved unsuccessful. And O'Sullivan also was the associated with the propagandist, but he's well known in this country as the man who suggested the phrase manifest destiny, that Americans had a God-given right to expand across the entire continent and
Mhm.
basically expel Native Americans. So it's sort of a measure of the esteem in which Keene Richards was held by his fellow Confederates that he was invited to this very small wedding. There were probably no more than 12 or 15 people present altogether. Now, shortly after this, in early 1865, so I guess the wedding must have been in 1864, came the news to Britain of Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. And essentially the war was over for the Confederates. And so Richards contacted the American ambassador in England, who advised him that he needed to go home and swear an oath of allegiance and apply for amnesty. And so Richards did that. He was granted a pardon,
Mhm.
and he set about to try to rebuild his equine operations. Um, Transylvania Plantation had been in Union custody during the war. It was rented out to people for cotton cultivation. He reclaimed the plantation, but had tremendously bad luck. He expended tremendous sums, which he did not have. He mortgaged basically all of his property, um, to the tune of more than $1 million in today's money, and thought he was going to be able to recoup his fortunes by the cotton crops that could be made in 1866 and 1867. But Basically he met with disaster. The
Yeah.
first In both years there were major floods which wiped out the early cotton crop, and when they attempted to plant a second cotton crop, there was an invasion of army worms which consumed the cotton long before it could be harvested. Uh, One resident of the same parish in Louisiana in which Transylvania was located made note that they had spent something like $25,000 to harvest maybe 50 bales of cotton. So
Ooh. Yeah.
that's all they got. So it was a disaster, not just for Richards, but for every planter along that section of the Mississippi. The failure of the cotton crops. So life became very difficult for him. He became deeper and deeper in debt. He did the only bright light, I think, was he went back to Dentley Plantation and proposed to Mary Wynn,
Mm-hmm.
and they were married. And he subsequently had 3 children from her, all of whom survived into adulthood, all girls, and had to file for bankruptcy in 1868. He had
Oh.
executed so many notes, not just after the war, but some that he owed from before the war. He had spent so much money trying to bring Transylvania back into uh, production that he was just overwhelmed with debt. And so Transylvania and Bluegrass Park Home in Georgetown all went under the auctioneer's block. Fortunately, uh, his brother-in-law, who had married one of Mary Wynn's sisters, came to his rescue and purchased the properties. And a few years later, sold them back to Keene Richards. But unfortunately, Keene Richards remained heavily indebted,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually was bankrupted again, and the properties were once again sold. The Transylvania plantation was purchased at least by a family member, a cousin, so it stayed in the family. His home in Georgetown was purchased by a family friend who allowed Keene Richards to remain in residence there, and so he was able to continue his equine operations, although he could no longer afford to import horses.
Yeah.
Before the war, he had made several trips to England and imported some of the best English thoroughbreds to breed with his Arabian horses. He got involved in the new racing scene, which had shifted from the South because of the destruction of racing facilities throughout the Southland during the war, and that had shifted to the New York area. And so when I believe it was Jerome Park was one of the first new tracks. It was actually built, not the first new track, but one of the new tracks built in the New
Mm-hmm.
York area. And he was appointed one of the 50 life members, along with several other prominent Kentuckians. He was the racing steward at the inaugural racing of that racetrack. He brought back his horses from the Southland. They had been sent to Texas from Alexandria because Louisiana became increasingly unsafe. So they were sent to Texas for the duration of the remainder of the war. He brought them back, including War Dance. War Dance proved to be a very good investment for him because that horse was a good breeder and in very much demand. He was one of the leading sires of the thoroughbred era. His Arabian horses were dying off, his stallions, and so he kind of switched his emphasis from trying to create a thoroughbred Arabian hybrid for endurance, and that wasn't even necessary because the style of racing changed after the war. Heat racing was basically out. The English had abandoned heat racing long ago, about the time of the American Revolution, in favor of the short dash races such as we have today. And since the northern turfmen, who were building lavish horse estates and breeding and building many lavish and opulent racetracks, instead of following the Southern traditions, they wanted to adopt the English traditions. And so heat racing was out and dash racing was in. So there was no longer a viable rationale to continue trying to breed for endurance. And even the horses that Richard had in his second and third generation now of horses, they had not been particularly successful at racing. It turned out that the breeding Arabians back into thoroughbreds really didn't do anything for the thoroughbred except maybe slow them down.
No.
Arabians were never as fast as a thoroughbred, and
Yeah.
he was just trying not to increase the speed, but to increase the endurance, and that was no longer needed. In his last years of life, Richards endured one tragedy after another as his friends began to die off. Edward Troye died in, I think it was 1875, while visiting him at Georgetown. John C. Breckinridge died. His cousin Morris Keene committed suicide because he was bankrupted and basically heavily laden with debt, so he took his own life. His Georgetown house, which had been built by the founder of Georgetown, Elijah Craig, burned down. Fortunately, it was held during a court day, and all the people who were in Georgetown nearby saw the house on fire, and they all ran over to help save as much as they could. So all of Troy's original paintings were rescued, and Troye had done many paintings. I mean, Richards was a collector. He was his most prominent sponsor. He had either commissioned or collected about 36 of Troy's paintings.
Yeah.
All of these were rescued from the home, along with a lot of the Oriental memorabilia. I mean, Richards had brought back bits and pieces of just about everything he came across in the Middle East, something that would be highly illegal today. But I mean, he even brought back an Egyptian mummy for display in his home.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, Bluegrass Park looked very Oriental because he brought back Egyptian cattle. He had Yusuf Badra and his, costume there, with a dagger and scimitar and whatever, kind of entertaining people who came out to visit. He had camels on the property. I mean, it was like a trip to the Middle East, except, very green instead of being a desert.
Yeah, very exotic.
And then I guess one of the final blows came when some arsonists set fire to Bethany College. But fortunately, the paintings were separated from the area of the fire by a thick stone wall, and they were the first things that were rescued by the population of the community, who immediately rushed in to try to save as much as possible. To the end of his life, Richards believed that the Arabian cross would still be a good idea if he could just, had more time to work on it.
Yeah.
But he eventually ran out of time. He died in 1881, and at the time he was only 50 some years old. But he caught a cold and essentially refused to take care of himself. He sat in his room in the winter without a fire, in his library, and cold got worse and finally carried him off. Now, Richard's legacy, I think, is most important, not for his Arabian experiment, although that is a fascinating story. It had no real major impact upon the thoroughbreds of this country. The lines of the various Arabian horses that he brought back can be traced into the 20th, and some of them even into the 21st century, in ever diminishing, proportions of the bloodlines of modern horses. Most of them were transformed, by breeding from thoroughbreds into standardbred horses. Probably the most important contribution that was made by Keene Richards was to bring back some really superior English horses from his trips abroad, English thoroughbreds that became important contributors to American thoroughbred bloodlines. Probably the most important of these was a horse known as Australian. He was purchased by Keene Richards in 1858, I believe, or 1859, and was just a foal at the time, trotting along beside his mother. He was known as Millington, perhaps not a very auspicious name,
Hmm.
but he was brought back to Kentucky along with several other important English stallions and mares. And when Keene Richards departed from Kentucky to join the Confederacy, he sold this young horse, Millington, to Robert Alexander of Woodford County, who was probably the most important breeder in this country in the antebellum period. Robert Alexander renamed this horse Australian, and Australian became one of the leading sires of the 19th century, second only to Lexington in many years. Now, when I mean a leading sire, what this means is simply that the offspring of Australian were winning horses.
Hmm.
Won a lot of races and made a lot of money. And that's how they measure what a leading sire is. Now, the horse he brought back from Dentley Plantation, War Dance, was also, as I mentioned, one of the leading sires, but not quite as stellar as Australian, but still one that was very important in the thoroughbred bloodlines of the era, and his heritage remains important today.
Hmm.
So one of the things that Richards did when he brought back Arabian horses was to sell several of these to one of his most ardent supporters, a man named George Ferris of Texas. Ferris had lent Richards his support when he was discussing the need for Arabian importations with some of the other leading horsemen down in New Orleans, before the war. Ferris had ridden an Arabian during the Mexican War and been very fond of this horse, and thought, just like Richards, that Arabians ought to be bred to thoroughbreds in order to build a better horse. So Richards sold some of his prized Arabian imports to Ferris, and Ferris actually named one of his children Keene Richards Ferris. That's kind of an indication of how much they thought of each other.
Yeah.
And I sort of followed the career of these horses. Ferris also had a breeding program in mind to use his Arabians, but it was not to increase their speed on the racetrack, but he wanted to improve the Spanish horses of Mexico, which basically most of them had kind of gone wild and degenerated a bit, and so he wanted to breed Arabians into those in order to make a better Mexican horse. And according to his fellow Texans, he was very successful in doing that. Now, after Ferris died, his daughter was in correspondence with an equine historian during the 1930s. And she said that basically all of the Arabian horses that Richards had sold to Ferris and their descendants were now gone. They had not been looked after very well on the Ferris farm after Ferris died, and most of them had escaped. And so basically I ended my book with sort of an imaginary scene where we have a part Arabian Mustang out on the prairie who is pawing the ground and screaming his rage at a would-be usurper who's trying to take his mares, and who can trace his bloodline across 2 centuries and 1,000 miles to the Arabian desert. And that's sort of how I finished it up, kind of
Hmm.
wrapping things up. Now, that's the story. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about it.
Well, it's a very interesting story, about somebody that probably not a lot of people are going to know as far as Kentucky history, but somebody who definitely had an impact, and I would say a visionary, even though he did not necessarily complete the goal he set out to do, but there wasn't a necessity of it either. So that kind of, you know, uh,
Well,
matches up. But
it kind of reads like an epic adventure novel, if you
yeah,
hit the
yeah.
story of his life. And while he is not known outside of maybe Georgetown, Kentucky, to the ordinary citizen, he is very well known among people who are interested in equine history because he was one of the leading breeders in the United States uh, during the 19th century. He was considered an expert horseman, an expert judge of horse flesh. He seemed to be able to pick out the best specimens of either Arabians or thoroughbreds as breeding horses. Many historians have bemoaned the fact that what he could have done was to breed better thoroughbreds by breeding thoroughbred to thoroughbred, but that he wasted his fortune and his efforts by breeding them to Arabians.
Uh-huh.
But, he did have, as you say, a vision, that he could make a better thoroughbred, one that was better suited for the races that were so popular during his younger days. But the world changed on him.
Yeah. Yeah.
The war came, it interrupted his breeding experiment, so he was no longer able to supervise it or carry out any real tests of what was going on. He was unable to obtain more Arabians when those he had died out. And of course, the entire style of racing changed to where endurance was no longer really a part of racing. It was all about speed.
Hmm. And the question that looms over many Kentuckians or Kentucky historic Kentuckians, what would have happened if the war didn't happen? It would have changed probably his outcome, at least his financial outcomes, at least, and other things would have been different. So, um,
Yeah, it's kind of hard to predict exactly what would have happened. Would he have been able to successfully uh, bring Arabian blood into the thoroughbred, and would it have made any difference? That's the
yeah,
important question. Would
yeah,
it have made it for a better horse? Would the style of racing evolve to follow the English lead in dash races, or would it have heat races have remained popular? It's hard to say. I'm thinking that the war aside, these changes were inevitable anyway. I think that the wealth of the northern uh, Wall Street barons and industrialists would have been put into racing. That was a leisure pursuit that they could spend wealth on and display their wealth to others, which was always important.
hmm
And they created horse estates on a lavish style that can never be matched by the agricultural wealth of Kentucky. I think that these Northerners also were inclined to want to follow the English lead rather than to follow the Southern traditions of racing. So I think that the dash racing would have become the popular and prevailing mode regardless of the war. I think that the Arabian cross would probably never have been successful. And I think that Richards, though he remained to the end of his life believing that there was value to it, never would have proved to be of actual value.
yeah, yeah,
But despite that, he was a man who had a vision. He was a man who was consumed with a love for horses. And he was, in fact, uh, is owed a lot of credit for the horses that he did bring into this country, at least for the
hmm
thoroughbreds.
yeah. Um, well, where can people get the book at?
Well, basically, it's available almost everywhere right now. I mean, you can buy it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. If you do a Google search, you can probably find 50 or more bookstores in this country and also abroad that are offering the book for sale. Uh, so I think any major bookstore would make it available. It can also be ordered directly from the LSU Press, from their website. So it would be very easy to acquire. If I recall correctly, uh, well, this probably won't matter but right now Amazon is offering a 20% off sale on the book. So the list
Okay,
price is I think $44.95, and they're selling it for $35 at the present time.
okay, yeah, yeah, and we will put a link to order the book in the description too, if you want some more details about the adventures of Alexander Keene Richards. I mean, pretty remarkable story, and all that. Anything else before we go?
Uh, No, it's just I'm very thankful to be able to present Richard's life story here on the Kentucky podcast for the Kentucky History Channel. He is, I think, a Kentuckian who is often overlooked, but who is one of the best known Kentuckians, nationwide during his lifetime because of his. He raced in cities all over this country. He raced at Nashville, Mobile, New Orleans, Cincinnati, uh, Baltimore, Chicago, uh, you know, Memphis. He traveled a circuit around the country. Before the war and after the war. As he grew older, he began to shrink the size of that circuit from a dozen different courses in a single year down to just visiting two or three. But he was always a prominent. If when I was doing research on him, looking at newspaper archives, his name will pop up in newspaper searches thousands of times. Some of these are just race reports,
Yeah.
and a lot of them are personal information about him. I would also like to mention that very early on, I contacted some of his descendants who live in Louisiana and in Mississippi, and they were kindly provided me with original family documents, family photographs, and since they own many of the Edward Troye paintings that Richards commissioned, they also gave me permission to reproduce those, for which I am very grateful.
Yeah, that's a it's a great story that people do need to know about. I mean, and again, a very fascinating historical figure. A lot of people look at the Civil War, and he was involved in that too. So,
Yeah.
um, a lot to dive into. Again, uh, Gary, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for writing the book. So, just helping get more Kentucky history out there. And again, once you finish your next book, you can come back on and talk about it. So,
Okay, I would like to point people or direct folks to my website, which is called Tales from Old Kentucky. And it's a very simple website address. It's Gary-Odell, GARY-ODELL.com, where you can find a lot of my published work is available to download and read.
all right, yeah, that sounds good. And we'll put that link in the description as well. Again, thanks for joining us, and thank you all for listening. And we'll see you next time.
Happy to have been here.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.